From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I think we're ready to start. My name is Eleanor Shevlin, and along with my colleague Sabrina Barron, who unfortunately could not be here today, we organized the Washington Area Group for Print Culture Studies. And the program today is one that we are co-sponsoring and thrilled to be co-sponsoring with John Cole, the Center for the Book at the Library of Congress, and also the National Women's History Museum. So it's a very appropriate that these three groups come together to sponsor. Right here I see my own books. I'm just going to say one or two words quickly about the Washington Area Group for Print Culture Studies. We've been meeting for about 12, 13 years at the Library of Congress, and we usually meet from the first Friday of the month from September, with the exception of December and January because of the holidays, through April. If anyone is interested in being added to our reflector list, please let me know after the program. I also want to make a quick announcement about our April meeting. It will be, instead of April 6th, it will be April 13th. And instead of meeting at the Library of Congress, we're going to have a tour of Shakespeare's Sister, curated by Georgiana Ziegler at the Folger right across the street. And so we would love to have anyone who is interested join us for that. I also would be remiss not to note that this is a publication celebration, and we have a table set up for book sales and signing, and we hope that after we hear these two wonderful presentations, you all will make use of that. Now I'd like to introduce John Cole from the Library of Congress Center for the Book. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Eleanor, and welcome to the Library of Congress. I am the director of the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress, which is the reading promotion arm, but also a book history arm, which is why we are one of the partners in this activity. I'm also a historian of the Library of Congress, and in 1 minute, I want to tell you about the wonderful room that you are in. It's called the Whitall Pavilion, named for Gertrude Clark Whitall, who in the 1930s donated 5 Stradivari instruments to the Library of Congress to be played in next door in our Coolidge Auditorium, which had been opened in 1925. You can't really see it, it's through the entranceway. But Mrs. Whitall is the kind of donor everyone wants. Not only did she present the instruments, she presented an endowment for their care, and she also presented funds to build this pavilion in which they are housed. And the room is administered by our music division. There's a major music program here at the library, of course, and it is often used for very special occasions, such as this one. The way that the program is going to work is after, as Eleanor was saying, we will have a book signing after the program. The books are actually for sale in the foyer in the back, but I think we will actually have the book signing right up here at the front table. We also are filming this for the Library of Congress's website. All of the Books and Beyond presentations, of which this is part, are connected in one way or another to the Library of Congress, its collections and its programs, and we keep a record of this, and the Books and Beyond programs are on the Center for the Book's website, which is read.gov, or you just come right to the front page of the Library of Congress's website and you can get there through the Young Readers Center or the Center for the Book. Because we're filming, we'd like you to turn off all things electronic. There will be a brief question and answer period, which Eleanor will narrate at the end, and I hope that you participate, but as a good federal employee, I'm obligated to tell you that your participation in that is, in effect, your permission for us to use your image and your wonderful words, if we so choose, as part of the webcast. I believe, Betsy, that Anne has not arrived yet. Is I correct?
I believe that.
All right. Well, to represent our third partner in this wonderful cooperative activity, the National Women's History Museum, I'm very pleased to present their national consultant, Betsy Shergan. And Betsy is the person we have had the pleasure of working with, in fact, to plan this event. And she will tell you a little bit about the museum and the partnership that we are all part of. Let's give Betsy a hand.
Thank you, Joan. I know that probably Anne will be joining us shortly. But we do pride ourselves on getting the program going. So here I am, and John, thank you very much for hosting us at this beautiful pavilion and for allowing us, Eleanor, to partner with your group. We are thrilled to be here. This book has had a special place in our hearts for well over 2 years. I was very privileged to be at the National Women's History Museum headquarters when Joan Wages, who is our national president and CEO, had made an appointment with a Dr. Wiegand, and he was going to be visiting, and I just happened to be there. So my good fortune, everything in life is a little bit of luck and timing, and here we are today. Throughout the last 2 years, this is the first time face-to-face that I've had the privilege of meeting Sarah Wadsworth, who is the co-author of this book. But I had the privilege of hearing Wayne last night at a book appearance, just giving a brief overview. And I think that not only will you enjoy hearing their presentations today, but you will also enjoy reading the book. Because I was privileged to get just a brief summary of it to begin with, and then hearing Wayne last night was absolutely wonderful. This is particularly a good occasion for us at the National Women's History Museum because we were founded in 1996. Another luck and timing kinds of story. A woman by the name of Karen Stacer came, and she was bringing her young daughter to visit Washington. And her daughter happened to comment about, where are all the women? And Karen didn't really have a good answer to all of that, and looking at the statues and the portraits and visiting various and sundry places, Martha Washington perhaps and some others, but that was about the end of it. So Karen put her mind to organizing a group of women to establish a National Women's History Museum. And the very first thing that we did was to raise money to move the statue from the crypt of the U.S. Capitol, no less, of three of our founders on the suffragists. And we moved it to the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. And so that was the very first thing we did, to have a presence of women who had been so very, very prominent in getting the vote and in helping establish women. Throughout the last years, we have been very, very busy working on, since we had no physical presence in a museum, we have a very active online exhibitions, and they are wonderful. There are 21 of them up now, and they cover diverse groups, many, many different times in our history. So we are really thrilled to be a part of this today. For those of you who have followed us, I will say that we have been pursuing a site for the museum for quite some time. All of you are very familiar with the ways of Washington. When we try to explain this to people around the country, it gets sort of lost in, you know, why are you doing this? Why don't you just build it? The kind of process that we have to go through, because the original proclamation and resolution that was issued during the Clinton administration called for a National Women's History Museum on or near the mall, and our group was chosen. And so in order to do that, we need literally an act of Congress. And then once we get the act of Congress, we can then negotiate with GSA for a site and a building, which we are planning to pay for privately. So, you know, it should make perfect sense, and everybody is saying, yes, it should, but we are still moving right along. So that's a bit of background about the museum. We are very, very pleased, as I said, to have Sarah and Wayne, and I'm not sure which of you will go first. Sarah, okay. Well, I'm going to have to read this. I had it all memorized last night, but I didn't know I was going to be called upon to the privilege to introduce these two people. Sarah Wadsworth is an associate professor of English at Marquette University, where she specializes in early American literature. She is the author of The Company of Books, Literature, and the Classics in 19th-Century America at the University of Massachusetts Press, and that is a recent publication of 2006. And she's contributed articles to numerous journals, reference books, and edited collections. Her honors include fellowships from the Houghton Library at Harvard, the American Library Association, the PEO Sisterhood, which I'm very familiar with, and the Bibliographical Society of America. And she's the past president of the History of Reading Special Interest Groups of the International Reading Association. And she currently serves on the executive board at the Nineteenth-Century Studies Association. So much to achieve and be so young. Wayne Wiegand is the F. William Summers Professor of Library and Information Sciences, Studies Emeritus at Florida State University. And by the way, FSU is going to have a fabulous panel on the 23rd of March on the campus. I think it's going to be about 6 or 7 women scholars. So if you happen to be in Tallahassee, or you know someone who is lives in Tallahassee, please feel free to look at some material that I have, or you can go online to www.nwhm.org, and you'll see a whole list of the presentations that Wayne and Sarah will be making. I love this because Wayne has often been referred, and I can understand why, as the Dean of American Library and Historians, which I think, you know, with that august title, he knows almost everything. In addition to over 100 scholarly articles, and anybody who's familiar with academia knows that's a whole lot, he is the author of the irrepressible, like he is, Reformer, a biography of Melville Dewey, and 8 other books, including Main Street Public Library, Community Places, and Reading Spaces in the Rural Heartland from 1876 to 1956, and that was just published in October 2011. So he serves as the president of the Friends of the Library at Florida State. He is an extraordinary person to know and to hear speak. I'm looking forward to hearing, we all are, Sarah as well. So without further ado, may I present the co-authors of Right Here, I See My Own Books, the Woman's Building Library at the World's Columbian Exposition. Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank Eleanor, John, and Becky for giving us such a wonderful, warm welcome, and to express a sense of privilege and honor I have for being a speaker here at the Library of Congress. I'd like to thank also the Center for the Book for hosting us, the Washington Area Group for the Study of Print Culture, and the National Women's History Museum, to which we are very happy to be donating royalties for this book. And finally, I'm delighted to see so many of you in the audience, and I look forward to your questions and comments during the Q&A period. On May 1st, 1893, the city of Chicago opened a World's Fair exposition. During its 6-month run, 27 million guests visited the buildings and studied the exhibits, which displayed cultural products from across the nation and around the globe. The exposition was a spectacular success. Ever since, historians have considered it a watershed event in American cultural history. Among the structures occupying space on the Court of Honor that surrounded a man-made lagoon just off the Lake Michigan shoreline was the Women's Building. Which for the first time officially recognized women at a World's Fair as contributors to world culture. Under the direction of Chicago socialite Bertha Honoré Palmer, of Palmer House fame, a board of lady managers had assembled exhibits from around the world to demonstrate the progress women had made since Christopher Columbus had discovered, quote unquote, the New World in 1492. And occupying space in a very large room on the second floor was a library of 8,000 volumes written, edited, illustrated, or translated by women and representing women from all over the world. Between May 1st and October 30th, many thousands of fairgoers spent untold hours screening the titles contained in the Women's Building Library and listed in its catalog. In effect, this collection represented a cultural cameo of books by and about women never before assembled. Women's Christian Temperance Union President Frances Willard remarked when she visited it, had the Board of Lady Managers accomplished nothing else than bringing these books together, it would have done a great deed. Expressing a similar sense of accomplishment and pride, humorist Marietta Holley had the folksy protagonist of her novel Samantha at the World's Fair say, "Right here I see my own books. There they was, a-standin' up just as noble and pert as if they was at home in the whatnot behind the parlor door, not a feelin' the least mite put out before princes or czars." For Willard, Holley, and countless others, the Women's Building Library of the World's Columbian Exposition offered a vital counter-narrative to the exclusionary practices of a patriarchal print culture, even as it perpetrated its own exclusions. The women responsible for the creation of the Women's Building Library were keenly aware of the unprecedented opportunity the building afforded to spotlight women's contributions to fine and applied arts, education, family life, service, healthcare, and other fields in which women had labored. While upholding the underlying construction referred to as true womanhood, the exhibits and events held in the Women's Building sought to extend the range of women's domestic activities into the public sphere. Similarly, the library's interior design reflected both a validation of the feminine values associated with separate sphere ideology, relegating women to the privacy of the home and restricting their participation in public life, and a critique of that ideology. In order to signal the resulting combination of values, femininity, domesticity, and benevolence, but also education, progress, and professionalism, the Board of Lady Managers had paid special attention to the aesthetics of the room. The committee that oversaw the library's design carefully devised a decor that recalled the reassuring solidity and exclusiveness of a well-appointed private library. In taking this approach, the committee departed from architectural and decorating imperatives of mostly male library leaders who in the 1890s preferred to emphasize bureaucratic efficiency and utilitarian purpose in planning library spaces. But Candace Wheeler, the nationally known New York textile designer and interior decorator who designed it, had very particular ideas about libraries that emphasized the connection between these traditionally masculine spaces and the familiar feminine sphere of domesticity. In her book, Principles of Home Decoration, published in 1903, Wheeler insists that a library is not only to hold books, but to make the family at home in a literary atmosphere. Thus, she concludes, the color scheme may and should be much warmer and stronger than that of a parlor, pure and simple, the very constancy and hardness of its use indicating tints of strength and resistance. For Wheeler, such a room is apt to be a fascinating one, in part because of its variety of uses, and in part because of the family treasures it holds. Books, pictures, papers, photographs, bits of decorative needlework, she explained, all center here, and all are on most orderly behavior, like children at a company dinner. Moreover, she suggests, the aesthetics of the room should blend harmoniously with its natural surroundings, emphasizing the distinctiveness of its location and environment. Elsewhere in the Woman's Building, Wheeler had felt herself constantly restrained by the need to take a safe approach to interior design and decoration, but the library allowed her more scope. I felt that both its purpose and its place demanded the use of every appropriate means of beauty, she later wrote. After seeing the nobility of the room's proportions and the one great window, which seemed to take in all the blue of the sky and the expanse of water which lay under it, I felt that it would be an insult to this dominant color to introduce anything else in this sheltered space which would be at war with it. Consequently, I chose modulations of blue and green for the color treatment. The library's design apparently achieved the desired effect, that of recreating the atmosphere of a lavish home library within the public space of the Woman's Building in a manner that harmonized naturally with its physical setting. Maud Howe Elliott, daughter of Julia Ward Howe, an editor of art and craft in the Woman's Building, praised the domestic character of the interior design as follows. From a purely artistic standpoint, the library is the most important feature of the building. After the Hall of Honor, the room has a character and individuality that we rarely find save in the house of some aesthetic lover of books. There is no single apartment in the whole fair where the visitor will find himself so pleasantly at home. Equally impressed, the magazine Art Amateur declared it among the very best bits of interior decoration at the fair, and described it in terms that suggest an idealized feminine deportment, noting that the whole effect of the room is reposeful, quiet, and cheerful. To Board of Lady Manager's secretary, Susan Gale Cooke, the room's color scheme was its crowning charm, being a harmonious blending that invited rest and quiet and suggested elegant literary ease. The Chautauquan informed its readers that the large and well-filled library presents a cozy appearance. The overwhelmingly positive response attests to the success of Wheeler's committee in using interior design to project the outward appearance and feminine values of the private domestic sphere onto this very public space. As is intimated by Wheeler's mention of the nobility of the room's proportions, the exhibits and decor cultivated a high cultural elitism along with an elegant domesticity. An elaborately carved 12-foot oak fireplace formed the room's focal point, its openings screened by a custom-made hanging of blue silk brocade woven with a pattern of stylized oak leaves that matched the room's portieres. At either end of the library stood two large standards framed with wings, containing a collection of autographs and documents written by such noble and notable women as Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth, Mary Queen of Scots, Catherine de' Medici, George Elliott, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. A gilded frieze encircled the walls, and affixed to the ceiling was a large painting by Wheeler's daughter, Dora Wheeler Keith, depicting allegorical figures framed within large oval medallions, enclosed within a border of Venetian scrollwork, The central oval featured mythical figures representing realms of intellectual endeavor, science, literature, and imagination. Medallions in the corners, connected by images of drapery intertwined with lilies and streamers, framed the literary genres of history, romance, poetry, and drama in a similar allegorical guise. To avoid straining their necks, viewers could examine the images by peering into a mirror placed atop a large dark oak table in the room's center, hand-carved with 16th century designs. Visitors could repose in similarly carved antique oak chairs and sofas upholstered in dark green leather by Associated Artists of New York, a firm Candace Wheeler had founded with Louis Comfort Tiffany. Paneling of the same dark oak lined the walls above the carved walnut bookcases, on top of which, at calculated intervals, specimens of hammered brass and pottery from Rookwood, one of the first U.S. companies owned and operated by a woman, alternated, on special occasions, with graceful palms. On the walls above the glass-covered bookcases hung portraits of many women whose works appeared in the collection, including early American novelist Charlotte Lennox and a prominent oil painting of the popular American poet Lydia Huntley Sigourney, framed autographs of women writers and illustrations by Mary Halleck Foote, Kate Greenaway, and other women artists, and a portrait of Pocahontas held a place of honor over the mantelpiece. Wheeler also made sure that busts of notable women by notable women were decoratively used. Chandeliers above, painted walls at either end, and a Turkish carpet patterned in red and blue completed the decor. All this contrasted sharply with other libraries recently erected across the country, almost all of which exhibited busts of famous men whose names and literary quotations were often chiseled into building cornices and whose portraits frequently hung over library fireplaces. In addition to evoking old world stateliness and refinement, the room's decor prominently displayed artwork created by and representing American women. In doing so, it implicitly placed the contributions of American women within the context of European traditions, set their work alongside those of the most admired European women, and distinguished Americans among all nationalities represented as meriting heightened attention. In one corner, a 5-foot mahogany cabinet with glass sides and glass shelves showcased an early portrait of Harriet Beecher Stowe, copies of 42 translations of Uncle Tom's Cabin, its 2-volume first edition, the latest reprint by Houghton Mifflin, and a beautiful silver inkstand Stowe had received from English supporters. A marble bust of Stowe, who was still living in 1893 but too frail to journey to Chicago, gazed serenely from a granite pedestal nearby. The library also displayed a few items that alluded to American racial and cultural diversity, such as the portrait of Pocahontas over the fireplace and a Hiawatha sculpture by African-American, Native American artist Edmonia Lewis. Altogether, I was satisfied, Wheeler concluded. I felt that the women of all America would not be sorry to be women in the face of all that women had done besides living and fulfilling their recognized duties. Most visitors seemed to agree. In late June, a Canadian fairgoer reported to her local newspaper that a whole day devoted to this one room would repay one richly. Frances Willard was effusive. Echoing the rhetoric of progress that pervaded the entire exposition, Willard identified the library as an amazing collection of books written by women that demonstrated a history of women in letters. To Willard, the library revealed this history by showing what a thin, long line it was during many centuries and how it has rapidly broadened out in a magnificent way since education has opened the door to almost every department of science and art. Board of Lady Managers member Rebecca Felton, who in 1922 would become the first female U.S. senator, observed that the library's very atmosphere became redolent with the greatness of American women in literature and fine art. Written in 16 languages, the library's 8,000 volumes represented women in 23 foreign countries and every U.S. state and territory but 9. No less remarkable, the contributions of each region were assembled and vetted by women in that region, resulting in a collection that was both collaborative, democratic, at least in theory, and diverse in genre, as well as geographically diverse. Naturally, the states of the eastern seaboard had larger populations and longer traditions from which to draw, but the women of the Deep South, Middle West, and West admirably compensated for their smaller numbers and more recent settlement by recovering an impressive number and variety of locally authored publications. While these texts are overshadowed completely in conventional literary histories, the collaborative, geographically diffuse methods through which the Women's Building Library developed make it possible to re-envision how the women of each region imagined and constructed a literature of their own, simultaneously revealing and reinforcing the primacy of regionalism as a vital category in the print culture of late 19th century America. Mary Lockwood, chair of the Board of Lady Managers committee in charge of the library, reported that 1,453 women around the world had identified and selected 3,000 books from non-U.S. authors, while 2,628 American women, representing 31 out of 40 states and territories, had participated in the identification and selection of nearly 5,000 books by American women. And in the U.S., she said, women across the nation had worked hard to put their collections together. The Board of Lady Managers had declined to put into place any formal mechanism for vetting and admitting contributions to the library. Instead, it was left to the literary committees of the various state and foreign boards to identify, select, acquire, and convey to the Columbian Exposition the literary productions of each region. Inevitably, these contributions varied in completeness and character according to the diverse criteria used to determine inclusion. These criteria ranged from the broadly inclusive to the highly selective to the seemingly haphazard. New York, which upheld the original ideal of comprehensiveness, sought to contribute all works by all authors, native or at any time resident in the state, resulting in a collection of well over 2,000 of the 5,000 U.S. titles. Massachusetts, in contrast, confined itself to one book per author of the best works, while Connecticut considered only authors born in state. Some states, one suspects, sent whatever happened to turn up. As Lockwood enumerated state contributions, she demonstrated that the Board of Lady Managers had chosen gender to challenge a constrained definition of literary culture in the late 19th century, and the concept of library as an agency of that culture that the new profession of librarianship was articulating at that time. As she summarized women's efforts, state by state, to identify Native daughters who had participated in local cultures of print, her report hinted of the many difficulties arising from the fact that women had not been central to the publishing establishment, but rather had operated chiefly on its periphery. The contents of the library frequently tested contemporary definitions of quality. Library professionals of the late 19th century were adamant about their responsibility to elevate the taste of the reading public they served with the books endorsed and legitimated by cultural authorities. They operated on the assumption that if their libraries made only good books available to readers, they would make a substantial contribution to solving problems attending immigration, industrialization, and urbanization by enabling the masses to educate themselves, thereby reducing threats to the social order. As Teresa West, director of the Milwaukee Public Library, put it, the central idea of the modern library is to help mankind into fuller, freer, more perfect life. This commitment was most evident in the model library the American Library Association had put together for its exhibit elsewhere on the grounds of the Columbian Exposition. A committee of librarians had exercised great care in selecting the 5,000 volumes on display in the ALA exhibit. They first computed the average percentage of the total collection found in each subject in selected American public libraries. They then used the Osterhout Free Library of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, as a test collection, checked its entries against standard bibliographical guides and other library catalogs, and sent the pool of possibilities to about 75 libraries for a vote. The results of the vote were critiqued and revised by a panel of subject specialists, including a number of university professors. as Catherine Sharp, director of Chicago's Armour Institute Library and Library School, noted, as a result of this rigorous process, the books now on the shelves of the ALA Model Library represent the thoughtful recommendations of experienced librarians and scholars. As casual observers discovered, however, the Women's Building Library did not reflect the same commitment to quality literature. In addition to a host of cookbooks, Sunday school texts, and devotional books, the collections included many self-published and privately published texts issued in small editions, along with various kinds of ephemera, privately circulated volumes such as scrapbooks and manuscript books, and works by popular authors excluded from the ALA's model library, the sensationalist E.D.E.N. Southworth, for example, working girl favorite Laura Jean Libby, mystery writers Anna Catherine Green and Mary R.P. Hatch, sentimental novelists Martha Finley, Augusta Jane Evans, Mary Jane Holmes, and Anna and Susan Warner, passionate poet Ella Wheeler Wilcox, girls series book author Elizabeth Champney, prolific evangelist Hannah Whitall Smith, and many others. Based on statistics gathered from their sampling of American public libraries, the ALA had devoted only 15% of the model library to works of fiction. In contrast, fiction comprised roughly double that percentage in the American section of the Women's Building Library. Although it did not tout the role of gender, the collection of titles in the ALA library nevertheless reflected the political compromises of a male-dominated literary establishment. Huckleberry Finn, for example, was omitted owing to the controversy surrounding the novel's suitability for young readers. The titles in the Women's Building Library, on the other hand, reflected the political compromises of many groups of women, most of them upper and middle-class white women who had a shared interest in putting it all together.
Preface to my formal remarks. Alice Roosevelt Longworth once was asked to describe Calvin Coolidge, and she said, "Looks like he was weaned on a pickle." My mother would usually say that when she took a photograph of me as a child to get me to smile. And these Klieg lights are going to make me scowl. So I want you all to know inside I'm a really happy person. Aside from the issues of quality, professional librarians could not help but notice other things distinguishing the women's library from the late 19th century American public library. First, visitors were not allowed to pull books from the shelves and page through their contents. Closed stacks marked a dated philosophy of service that celebrated the book as artifact and a treasure to be protected. Open stacks increasingly characterized modern library practice and celebrated the book as a useful tool in self-education. Second, the books in the library were arranged first by state and or country. This had been forced on Palmer by the New York delegation. Thereafter, if the state or country's contribution was sizable enough to justify it, by subject. This arrangement ran counter to a basic premise of library service commonly found in a unified subject-author public catalog. Dover, New Hampshire Public Library Director Caroline Garland, who worked half days in the women's library for a month, noted that many of the practices there were not in accordance with advanced library ideals, but it must be remembered that this is not a working library, but an exhibit, and as such should be arranged as artistically as possible. The construction of the public card catalog of the Women's Building Library reflected additional differences from the model ALA library. Lockwood reported that visitors had access to a partially completed, alphabetically arranged subject-author catalog of nearly 9,000 cards that contained two types of entries. One gave statistics on each author represented in the collection and included date and place of birth and death, if applicable, and some information about the author's education and life work. The other gave conventional library information on each book in the collection and contained a Dewey Decimal number. In 1893, the DDC, in its second edition, was being adopted by the increasing number of public libraries opening up in communities all over the United States. Lockwood also indicated that librarians present in the room were informing visitors that at the conclusion of the exposition, the library intended to publish a printed catalog of the collections, all arranged in the DDC scheme. This particular list is a very abbreviated bibliography, and the only thing we found to document what was in that library. That public card catalog got lost. Librarians who worked on the catalog were not entirely satisfied with the system, however. Owing to the patriarchal structure of Western society, the cataloging rules librarians had developed over the centuries did not easily accommodate the contents of the women's building library. For an American library cataloger working in the last decade of the 19th century, cataloger Edith Clark wrote, "Dealing with women in literature was a thorn in the flesh because of frequent name changes. How to catalog the novel Ramona, whose author, Mrs. Helen Maria Fisk Hunt Jackson, had been twice married. ALA rules required that women be entered under their own personal names in library catalogs instead of their husbands, but to do so would require a well-known author, Mrs. Burton Harrison, who autographed your books with that name, to be entered under an unrecognizable Mrs. Constance Carey Harrison. To be consistent, Clark rejected a request by Mrs. E. Lyndon Bates that her chosen name be respected, and instead a cross-reference was ruthlessly made from that form to Mrs. Josephine White Bates, under which guise her works now appear. Other oddities invaded the catalog. Mrs. Fred Barnaby masquerades under the burden of Mrs. Elizabeth Alice Frances Whitsed Barnaby, Maine, where I hope her readers may have the good luck in finding her, an exasperated Clark declared. Practices in non-English speaking countries further complicated matters. Upon marriage, Italian, Swedish, Austrian, and Spanish women often connected their original names with their husbands' surnames. In Slavic countries, family names often had masculine and feminine forms. Because of inconsistencies in practices from country to country, Clark later revealed on occasion she had to toss up a penny, enter under one form, refer from the other, and not worry. Some authors changed nationality after marrying. English poet Agnes Mary Frances Robinson had crossed the Channel to become Madame Jacques Demestier on her title pages, and Clark found no consistency in the use of the form Mrs. in every language. Catalogers in the room, I'm sure, are sympathizing a great deal with Miss Clark. All of these problems, which demonstrate how library practices address the female and foreign other, greatly slowed the task of cataloging the collection. While the women's library stretched the boundaries of late 19th century notions of culture, not all women's work was fairly represented. When the World's Congress of Representative Women met at the World's Fair from May 15 to May 21, two prominent African American women delivered major addresses. Four others commented on presentations. Emphasizing gender over race, Frances Harper argued that the United States needed women to stand foremost among the nations of the earth. Fannie Barrier Williams pushed race to the center of her address on intellectual progress and present status as she castigated the white establishment for its sordid legacy of racism. In brief remarks that followed, Anna Julia Cooper noted the history of African American women is full of heroic struggle, she said, a struggle against fearful and overwhelming odds that often ended in a horrible death to maintain and protect that which women holds dearer than life. It is not known if any of these women toured the library while attending the fair to check for books by African Americans. If they had, however, they would have found several of Harper's publications, including her novel, Eola Leroy, or Shadows Uplifted, but not Cooper's Voices of the South or Ida B. Wells's Southern Horrors, both published the year before, both authored by native daughters of states whose white representatives on the Board of Lady Managers had pledged in 1891 to cooperate with any person appointed to represent the colored people in this state in order that the whole exhibit of our state may be brought out. The board proposes to extend its helpful influence throughout this vast country and around the world, Lady Manager Mary Logan regularly told her audiences. The board proposes to extend its helpful influence throughout this vast country, across the sea, around the world, Lady Manager Mary Logan regularly told her audiences. It ignores politics, isms, rank, and race. It is women clasping hands with women, she said. The paucity of text by non-whites in the Women's Building Library reflects the socioeconomic conditions in 19th century America and the extremely limited opportunities available to women of color to write and publish books. Neither the Board of Lady Managers nor the General Federation of Women's Clubs, with their white, Protestant, middle-class biases and exclusionary practices, did much to mitigate the situation or to heighten the visibility of the few texts by minority authors that did find their way into the collection. The Board of Lady Managers refused to grant separate exhibits for women of color, despite the insistence of a prominent group of African American women from Chicago that under the present arrangement and classification of exhibits, it would be impossible for visitors to the exposition to know and distinguish the exhibits and handwork of the colored woman for whom those of the Anglo-Saxons, and because of this, the honor, fame, and credit for all meritorious exhibits, though made by some of our race, would not be duly given us. As a result of the board's refusal to cooperate with the Women's Columbian Association, led by African American Letty Trent, and the Women's Columbian Auxiliary, led by African American Mrs. R.D. Boone, any books penned, edited, illustrated, or translated by minority women were merged with the collection as a whole, apart from a handful of books included in the small Afro-American exhibit. That's a list of their exhibits. Assembled by New York's Joan, Imogen, Howard. From the earliest discussions of the Board of Lady Managers, the representation of underrepresented groups, initially women, had engendered controversy. To some women, the very idea of creating a separate exhibit solely for women threatened to marginalize them and trivialize their accomplishments. For other women, the prospect of an entire building devoted to high-profile displays of the unique accomplishments of women better served their interests by drawing heightened attention to their achievements, giving them control over how they were to be represented, and providing a physical meeting place as well as a social and ideological nexus for the millions of women who would converge on Chicago fairgrounds. In private, one lady manager argued that women's exhibits should have been displayed side by side with the men. Equally emphatic was an editorial in the magazine Forum that criticized the building for its emphasis on material results rather than women's social relations with the home. Even the imposing collection of books written by women and kept with such devotional spirit in the library and the women's building, it complained, emphasized things temporal at the expense of things spiritual. In this critic's eyes, the effect was merely a humorous one, suggesting as it does the immodest modesty of a New England spinster who once set all the volumes written by men in a row on one side of her library and all those written by women in chaste seclusion on the other. Moreover, not all visitors shared the kind of middle-class values the women's building made manifest. Were these pictures all painted by a woman, a severe lady, a newspaper reporter described her, asked in early May? I'll warrant you they didn't have families to look after, or they'd never have found the time. Upon observing an opera cloak made of prairie chicken feathers, she remarked tartly, the woman might have found better use of her time. After she toured the building, including the library, she pronounced, these things will do for rich people, but if you're poor, you just better not see them at all. Despite minor carping, the women's building quickly became a focal point for women who visited the fair. A fairgoer from Paris reported spending many days in the women's building, fascinated and never bored. For her, it was, without question, one of the most interesting places of the entire site. In her autobiography, Helen Keller recalled meeting there the Princess Maria Shyovsky of Russia and a beautiful Syrian lady. The Women's Building is now headquarters for the good-looking and the high-class young women of the world, the Chicago Record revealed. Within the four white walls, you can see more brilliant, more bright, intelligent faces, jaunty summer styles of the sensible kind, and confident but proper demeanor than you will be able to find anywhere else on the globe, which makes a specialty of studying womankind, the reporter noted. Seems that every girl who has studied or traveled or who has any special aspirations gives the woman's building a share of her time. Other journalists took notice. Daily, crowds of the sex, which more than outnumber its opposite, fill the women's building, Isabel Bates Winslow told readers of the magazine Far and Near. It was in the women's building, she said, that by their work, their intelligence, energy, and executive ability, women have won for themselves first rank among all unprejudiced and discriminating people. For some, the building also provided a site for statements on gender politics. At the special service window one day, a visitor asked, "Is this the ladies' building?" "It is the woman's building," the employee replied. "Ladies' building," came the sharp retort as the speaker left the window with an air of having impressed upon the attendant a great lesson. Why have a library of women's books was a standard question people ask when entering the literary exhibit. Why have a library of women's books is a standard question people ask when entering the literary exhibit, cataloger Edith Clark recounted. Why not let them take their place side by side with men and be judged equally with them? In her own mind, Clark told the Chicago Library Club after the fair closed, the reason was obvious and could be summed up in another question: why not? The Wisconsin Historical Society collected materials written by Wisconsin inhabitants, she said. Schools and colleges acquired works written by alumni, and many men collected books addressing their hobbies. Most of the library's visitors, Clark noted, came from small towns and country districts, and most, male and female, had seen women occupied only in housekeeping and the rearing of children. Once they had entered the library, however, many were amazed at when they are brought face to face with the achievements of the same abilities when brought into competition with men in art, literature, science, and business. And often, they remarked, "Why, I did not think there were so many books in the world written by women." Clark also reported that the literary critic and reformer Thomas Wentworth Higginson had spent a couple of hours there, and because he was so impressed with the remarkable library of women's writings, offered to donate his own 1,600-volume collection of women's works if the proposed permanent women's building library materialized. Numerous other testimonies echoed Clark's experience. Caroline Garland reported that one woman, attended by a sedate colored servant, she said, delivered her book in person. "It is the story of my life," she explained, adding that the book had changed the legislation of 32 states. As a young woman, she had been committed to a madhouse by her husband in order to take possession of her property. But after 3 years' confinement, she escaped, found friends, wrote books, then made successful applications to the states for better legislation in regard to the insane. This book joined 2 other exposés by the same author, Elizabeth Parsons Ware Packard, on the shelves of the Women's Building Library. Many newly published women authors also visited the library. They were, as a rule, hopeful, Garland observed, and entirely free from the vice of modesty. She recalled one who gave her a book she had written, "You'll read it, won't you?" When Garland responded, "If I have time," the author snatched it out of her hands. "I won't leave it if you don't promise to read it." Garland confessed that the librarian's desire to increase the size of the library got the better of truthfulness, and she promised the author she would read it. Garland also recalled a visit from Virginia Smith Jones, who donated a 2-volume set of illustrations of the nests and eggs of birds of Ohio, which was valued at $375 at that time, 1893, which she had worked on with 8 years of untiring industry, she said. When Garland asked, "How did you ever have the patience to complete it?" Jones responded, "I did it in memory of my daughter. She had just begun the work when she died, so for her sake, I made it as perfect as possible." The Women's Building often left an indelible impression on fair visitors, and those who described their glimpses of the library were undeniably impressed by the sight that greeted them. Guests were struck by the palatial repository, decorated in greens and blues to echo the hues of Lake Michigan, with accents of red, gold, and brown. They admired the exquisite gilding, ornate moldings, richly adorned Renaissance fireplace, neoclassical frieze, Turkish carpets, intricately covered tables and chairs, and gleaming bookcases filled with seemingly endless rows of books. So far as is possible, its collection of books and manuscripts shows what women have done in the literature in all times and all lands. The exquisite carving of the bookcases, the handsome wall decorations typical of the arts, science, and literature are all the results of women's thought and labor, the Chateaucan reported. The bookcases themselves surrounded the room filled with books, a great army of them, beginning with the very earliest utterances of women in print and following down the centuries to the present, building decorator Candace Wheeler recalled. Altogether, I was satisfied. I felt that the women of America would not be sorry to be women in the face of all that women had done besides living and fulfilling their recognized duties. Highlighting a handful of British authors, in this mammoth collection, Harriet Martineau, George Elliott, Frances Burney, Lady Jane Grey, highlighting a handful of British authors in this mammoth collection, Harriet Martineau, George Elliott, Frances Burney, Lady Jane Grey, Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte. Minneapolis journalist Marion Shaw echoed Wheeler's imperialistic metaphor, a great army of books, when she pronounced that the library gave indisputable evidence of women's inherent right to occupy the field of literature, since in this department she has come, seen, and conquered. The Women's Building Library functioned as cultural space, inviting the exchange of social capital to its tens, if not hundreds of thousands of visitors. Over the course of the fair's 6 months, the library was differently appropriated as a site and as a collection of printed materials. One female visitor used its comfortable furniture to breastfeed her baby. Others used it to make statements reflecting gender politics. Yesterday, my attention was directed in the library to an interesting exhibit, the editor of Women's Tribune noted in her July 7 World's Fair letter column. Autographed letters and portraits of noted women are placed under glass on a revolving stand. It would be impossible to give a complete list of letters in the collection. Hope this works. Oh, there we go. But among them were one or two from George Elliott, George Stands, from Queen Elizabeth to Mary Queen of Scots, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Lucretia Mott, Lydia Marie Child, etc. She marveled that sightseers should spend so much time in admiring laces and needlework rather than study this collection, which gives an insight into the character of these good women. Historians have concluded that the Women's Building demonstrated a desire to construct a closer balance between women's private and public lives, and at the same time to profile contributions women were making in their public lives. Having separate space in which to cultivate this balance also fostered gender solidarity and an enlarged sense of womanhood, and facilitated on a very large scale the kind of female institution building and networking that women's clubs across the country had undertaken in the late 19th century. The library constituted a record of a public sphere, manifesting an increased democracy for some women, newly included, but at the same time silently imposing boundaries outside of which others continued to reside. Yet, despite obvious class, race, and nativist biases, women who visited the Women's Building probably came away with an enhanced sense of achievement and inclusion in the public sphere. The Women's Building Library contributed to that sense of accomplishment and belonging. As a collection produced by women and judged by a jury of women's peers, the library presents a richly detailed cameo of the culture of print constructed by participants in the late 19th century women's club movement, a movement Estelle Friedman calls one of the largest manifestations of social feminism at the time. In addition, the library reflected significant changes in conventional thinking about library space. Although Andrew Carnegie's turn-of-the-century philanthropy stimulated a movement that soon made the American Public Library a ubiquitous civic institution, in the vast majority of communities, much of the impetus for starting these libraries came from women's organizations. The thousands of women's club members who visited the Women's Building Library in Chicago and subsequently returned to their communities to help establish the public libraries Carnegie money made possible, formed particular ideas about how those libraries should look, inside and out, responding to Candace Wheeler's efforts to make the library visitors feel at home in a literary atmosphere. The intense emotional and intellectual connection fostered by the social nature of reading that club women had experienced at home was easily transferred to the Women's Building Library. Many visitors to the library undoubtedly sensed an imagined community that the titles lining the bookshelves facilitated, one bound to some extent by time and geography, but to an even greater extent by gender. Equally important, the library represented an unprecedented landmark in the charting of women's literature as a vital cultural enterprise. At the same time, the celebration of women's important role in international print culture, together with an anti-canonical inclusiveness that validated the work of thousands of little-known women writers, conveyed a powerful message to the women who visited the library. Surveying the contents of its shelves, these women could join Marietta Holley in declaring, with mingled wonder, humility, and pride, "Right here, I see my own books." Now we got one more slide. Will it happen? There we go. Okay. For those of you aspiring researchers in the audience, one of the things we're doing on March 23rd at Tallahassee, I asked several of my colleagues on the FSU faculty to take a look at the library from their particular perspectives. And that is made possible because we, as much as we could, completed that abbreviated author title list by checking OCLC, WorldCat, etc., as much as we could, and making it on a machine-readable database. You will find that database at the site right at the bottom of the slide there. On March 23rd, some of my colleagues will be looking at the books in the Italian section, in the Bohemian section. One is looking at Southern writers. One is looking at women who wrote history. Another is looking at women, let's see, I'm sorry, some of it is escaping my attention. A colleague of ours, Maria Dalbello, who is teaching at Rutgers, is editing a volume on the foreign language one, and we both have a friend over in Paris. When we handed her the collection, showed her what was in the French library, the Library of French Materials, she looked at it and said, "I don't recognize any of these authors." So I made this point last night. Many of you probably are acquainted with the Norton Anthology of Women's Literature. The canons that we currently teach our students are not necessarily the canons that existed in 1893. And that cameo tells you something about the status of literature among women that we are currently, we don't know. So I'm happy to, all of you can, that is free and open to the public, right, Sarah?
Yes.
It's on the Marquette site, and you can play with it as much as you please. Oh.
What a wonderful set of two presentations, and it's also so wonderful. I'm so glad Sarah mentioned it because I forgot to, that the royalties from the sales of this book are going to the National Women's History Museum. That's very generous. And now, yes.
And I send this message out. I challenge all of my colleagues to do the same.
But we have time, yes.
Ann Stone of the Women's History Museum, who was trapped on 395. I am a testimony as to why public transportation is good, because it was a wreck and standstill. And I know Becky's covered some of this, but I wanted not only to personally thank you on behalf of the board, but also to say, hearing the presentations, luckily I was able to hear most of yours and all of yours, okay, that several things that both of you said really ring true today, even as we try to get our site for the museum and even have a museum the same arguments that were made about why there should be or not be a separate women's group at the Columbian Exposition. Still today, they say the same thing. But we would add one more argument past what they did back then, and that is to have all of women's accomplishments together in one museum will really shock people, because to see them spread out, it's not as powerful. When you find out what you don't know about women's history, you're going to be like I was when I first got educated on this. I was shocked, and then I got a little ticked off because I was trying to find this while I was growing up, and it was hidden from me. But I do want to say that this book is so important to even what we're trying to do, because part of why we want the Women's History Museum is because we know throughout history women's voice and women's views have been hidden, and our perspective is so different that it is important. And I'm sure in the stack of books at the exposition, they probably had the journals of the women as they went out west. And we know for sure that our whole view of the Wild West, which wasn't as wild as the men were writing it was totally changed when the women's journals were published. And we know that journals from the Civil War that were written by Southern women had an effect of keeping England out of coming in on the side of the South during the Civil War. So we know that throughout our own personal history that women's writings were so powerful. We know that the first publisher in the New World was a woman. Her husband was deceased on the way over, so Elizabeth Glover started the first publishing. So to have women so ostracized and so balkanized in their writings when we were the first to publish in the New World is again another amazing fact. But this work is so important and really is a part of why the museum was founded. We thank you again for your generous offer to donate the proceeds, and we will use them wisely. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you. And now let's open this up for questions. I'm sure that, yes.
Hi, what happens to the actual physical collection after the exposition closed?
After the exposition closed,
Yes. Yes. What happened to the actual physical collection after the exhibition closed? Very good question.
Okay, remember that the whole collection was really an assembly of multiple collections from many different states and countries all over the world. Many of those contributions went back to the groups who donated them. The largest single donor was the state of New York, and they had earmarked their collection for a display at the state Capitol in Albany, and it did go there, and for many years it was in place. However, I don't recall the year. 1911, there was a terrible fire at the Capitol building in Albany, and the collection was destroyed by the fire. The largest group of texts that remained together first stayed in storage in Chicago. There was hope at that time that a permanent women's building would be constructed, and then those books would go into the permanent library. Eventually, well, that didn't happen. Eventually, those books went to Chicago Public Library. Later, they were acquired by Northwestern University, which initially kept them together as a special collection of women's texts. Eventually, though, it was broken up and scattered, and the books are still there, but you can't access them as a collection.
But you can't pull them off the open shelf.
And we've suggested that Northwestern gather those books together again and reform this collection of women's texts.
Carol?
Yes, hi. I wonder, do you have any knowledge, any information about the kinds of editions that were included in the donations? I've noticed that all of your images are basically American cloth-bound books, picture readings about Americans. But since a lot of women weren't published by that kind of publisher that would have done that, you would have had some very different kinds of editions, not to say especially Europe, sending in very different editions. Are there any comments or any information about those kinds of material aspects of the books?
Should I take that one as well? And then I'll pass the mic to you. Yes, it was an excellent question about the specific editions that were contained in the collection. It's a really good question because, as Wayne pointed out in his part of the presentation, all we had to work with was this abbreviated shelf list that has author's last name and short title. We had to guess on the edition. And when we put the database together, our protocol was to have the research assistants who were doing the legwork or fingerwork for us locate the earliest edition, use that as the default. But I'll tell you, very often, there's only one edition of these books, so there was no great mystery around that. I'm sure that in many cases it wasn't, if there were multiple editions, it wasn't necessarily the first edition, especially if that edition were rare. It wasn't necessarily that one that was on the shelves. So there's some ambiguity. There's a lot that we don't know there. I have gotten some books through interlibrary loan. Those books with the Columbian Exposition book plate in them from Northwestern, they can go out on interlibrary loan. They've come to they've come to me in Milwaukee. I've seen books that are not exactly quality binding. Some of the books were scrapbooks, manuscript books. I don't know about paper bound or right. And even in the database, again, sometimes there's only one edition available, but we don't have a full description in the database. We have full author's name, title and subtitles, place of publication, date of publication, publishing house, and a place for notes. We also indicate what state contributed it, but we don't have a full description. It's possible that the full OCLC record might indicate that.
Were there any events going on at the time featuring best-selling authors doing book signings or things at the library?
No, I can't say categorically no, but I found no evidence to document that.
Was there any overlap with the ALA library?
Yes, there was overlap. We haven't done an exhaustive exercise of matching titles. That would be interesting to do. In fact, it would be interesting just to take that model ALA library and winnow out what texts by women were in there. I don't know if you've looked at that.
No,
I have to admit I haven't.
I can only give you a sense impression based on an adult professional lifetime of studying this stuff. Take that for what it's worth. Oh, sorry. You can't hear me?
Please raise your hands, too, if you can't hear. If you can't hear in the back, please let us know.
One of the things about... Oh, that's right. I'm sorry. One of the... I did an article on catalog of ALA Library, which for the librarians in the audience is the predecessor of things that like public library catalog, fiction catalog, the quinquennial editions that librarians breathlessly wait for to check their own collections against what they've got. I did an article on that, and what I found was that there were very rigorous standards applied to selection. This was also the time, you probably recall, when a lot of professions organized. The American Economics Association, the American Historical Association, American Political Science Association, and one of the characteristics of a humanities and social science discipline was to have a journal. And in that journal you had 2 or 3 major articles by which people made their careers by publishing, and then you had 3/4 of them were book reviews. That's what the librarians were trained to analyze. And so it was the canons that emerged from the traditional disciplines that librarians applied to the books they made selections for in the ALA catalog. And those canons were patriarchal in nature.
You keep referring to the idea that the library didn't reflect white, Protestant, upper-class type people. I don't know that the prevailing language must have been English. Were there any books in Spanish, Americans that were Spanish? Any books that were in another language? And also the second was, how do you tell the difference between a patriarchal and a non-patriarchal book? I mean, it's hard.
You read it.
You read it.
Yeah.
Still, it's subjective.
Of course it is, yes.
The two questions were, A, were there any Spanish books or Spanish books written in Spanish language or other languages? And also, how do you tell the patriarchal from the non-patriarchal books?
I'm happy to take part one if we don't take part two. And I get off lightly. In the book, we have a table of all of the numbers. We tabulated how many volumes were contributed by different countries. So first of all, I can tell you that Spain contributed over 500 books. There were fewer from Latin America, but Cuba contributed a book. Peru, 5 books. So there were certainly books in Spanish. Because our book focuses on the U.S. collection, and I spent a lot of time screening those titles, I can tell you that there were a couple of U.S. texts in Spanish. I'm thinking of one. It was actually called, I think it was the White House Cookbook. No, actually, the White House Cookbook was in German, but there was a New York cookbook in Spanish published in New York. There were a number of other U.S. books in German, and there were a number of U.S. books that were translations into other languages. But there weren't a lot of U.S. books in languages other than English.
There was a German population in the United States.
Huge. Yeah, the immigrant populations.
They were part of the evolution.
Did your other answer, Wayne, answer that question?
Yeah,
You read them.
I don't know
it's
if
a
I-
little flip.
I don't
That's
know,
fine.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think we'll move on. I know Ingrid, and then Anne, and then you have a question. Go ahead, Ingrid.
I have 2 questions. The first was, I was really interested in some of the descriptions that you had of interactions, of people kind of showing up and doing things. I think there was a description of someone breastfeeding there, and even just people dropping off their scrapbooks and so forth. So I was curious about what kind of record there was of audience, kind of the audience interaction with the collection. I didn't quite catch everything, but were these coming from diary entries, from letters, from periodical articles, coverage that way?
Yeah. Okay, the answer to that is, I would say 50% of audience reaction was made possible by the newspaper databases available to me here at the Library of Congress. How's that? Without those, if we'd have tried to write this book 20 years ago, we wouldn't have got that, because that newspaper database was at 425, 450 newspapers, and I just plugged in appropriate phrases, and Manitoba comes up with a reporter who frequented the thing. So most of that came from that. Other than that, it was just traditional historical research.
It's wonderful, just pieces of details
Yeah.
to be included. And then the other kind of related issue is, I was curious, I mean, I think it's tremendous you have this database that you're making available to people, but also I was wondering if there are any plans for any kind of, I don't know, like an interactive digital floor plan or something that might be done of the,
You want me to take-
of the
Sure.
building.
Okay.
I'm thinking of a resource that I've used when I teach an
Yeah.
arts class on the 1913 Armory show that takes you on a tour through the different rooms and captures things like audience reaction, and this was kind of the hot spot to be in the building. I didn't know if there are any kinds of plans or anything like that.
I'm old now, and I'm preparing for a life hereafter, so I can't take any more projects on. I'm not going to dump one on Sarah either, but I would like to hear, before I pass to the Library of Heaven, I would like to hear someone has undertaken to rebuild this library, like the Library of Congress rebuilt the Jefferson Library, and that when they put it together, they make the entire contents available online with a screen where you can touch, Sarah described this, you can touch the spine of the book and it opens up in front of you. So I'd like that to happen. I have no funding for that, but I envision ways. I think it'd be I think it's a neat thing to do. I think it would have again, you're really recovering a generation of women that has been lost to history.
I'd love to add that to our wish list for our research component of our endowment, but also it might be something to challenge library science courses all over the country, women's studies, to join together to help do that. It might be something we can suggest. But I wanted to ask, in your research, obviously this is American connected, but was there any discussion of things like Christine de Pizan's original, work that was the first about women's history, or Ephra Ben's Ornugu, The Tale of a Royal Slave, which with Defoe there's still a fight as to who was the first novel in the Western world, or the Chinese woman who wrote the first novel, etc. Was there any discussion of that? Did they know about those works?
I think they did. There were some very old manuscripts. There were different types of literary materials in the exhibit. Some were just the books sent that were in those cases along the walls. But there were also the autograph letters and illustrations on the walls. And there were some rare manuscript materials. I don't recall precisely if those materials, Christine de Pizan, I think, might have been represented. I don't know about Orinoco. And I haven't encountered any sort of record of discussion of these things. Yeah.
We'll have it.
Two brief questions. First of all, does this Library of Congress contain any volume of the exhibition that was exhibited in Chicago, one of the 5,000?
My guess is if you would sit at a desk in the Library of Congress and look at this database versus what they got in the Library of Congress, I'll bet 3/4. That's just my bet. 3/4 are in this library.
Okay, second question. The male establishment, political establishment of the time, starting with the White House, Congress, the Illinois State Legislature, did they show any interest or express support in the exhibit?
The question were, did any of the male legislators or the like express interest or support in this exhibit?
With the White House.
And the White House.
No. If Bertha Palmer were living in 2012, she would be Secretary of State, if not President. She was an extremely capable individual who had these powers of persuasion and diplomacy. That this description, as I recall, is Southern vowels rolled off her lips like fine flowers, or something like that. She was really a savvy individual. She had her husband convinced to donate $100,000 for the museum after the Columbian Exposition was over for the Women's Museum, but that never, I don't think it was Potter Palmer's problem that he didn't, that museum didn't start. I don't think there was just enough effort. So to be truthful, men didn't really care. It wasn't important.
We have two, well now we have three. Okay, we have a question here.
I'm wondering what happened to the building, if it's still in existence, and what is it used for?
Building was raised.
Like most of the buildings in the White City.
Yeah.
The Field Museum is an exception, but most of the Columbian Exposition was demolished. It was meant to be temporary to begin with.
I think there were some construction problems. They had to be raised anyway.
I don't know if they would have withstood a Chicago winter.
After the exhibit was over, vagrants and derelicts occupied some of the buildings for a while, so there were fires, and it was raised.
Yes.
Yes, in connection with being able to turn the pages virtually now, do you have a sense of how much of the library representative titles are already available in full view and Petty Trust?
And what was the last?
Petty Trust.
Oh, I'm not sure about that particular source, but as the project went along, I was continually amazed at how much was available on Google Books or other sources. Initially, I didn't even bother looking, but by the end of it, it was more likely than not that I would find a given book that I was looking for, whether in Google Books or Hati Trust or Open Library. I mean, that more and more sources are making these available. So that greatly facilitated research and quote checking at the end. Yes.
Within 25 miles of our voices, there are 2 ALA-accredited library schools who could take this on as a project.
That's what I
My understanding is a lot of young women writers and artists sort of interned at this exposition and got their starts. And there were books published from the Women's Building. Can you speak to that and in kind of research that was gathered that did survive, that was independent, in the sense that there were books published about the collection and about the women who participated.
We should repeat the question.
Oh, she's asking about if we could talk a little bit about I think, books that were prepared especially for the Columbian Exposition and materials developed at the time that described it.
And also the fact that many young aspiring women writers interned at the collection, at the women's library. And did you find any records?
Well, artists. So you were talking about
And
artists.
yeah.
Artists. I'm not sure about young writers getting their start, having a kind of official role. Librarians, yes, there was a team of librarians who helped run the building and be ambassadors of librarianship to the general public. Young writers were undoubtedly inspired by what they saw there, but I'm not aware of internships or anything like that. Having said that, there are a number of books that owe their existence to the exposition itself. One of them is, we showed a slide for it, the art and handicraft in the women's building. But there were others. Candace Wheeler, the designer, and by the way, that little frieze along the side of the slides, that's one of her designs. Candace Wheeler put together an anthology of verses about, it sounds a little wacky, but it was about Indian corn. And she was promoting that. There was a wonderful article on this, that she was promoting Indian corn as a new symbol for the nation instead of a militaristic, aggressive kind of, eagle carrying arrows or something like that. She was proposing Indian corn, and she had this anthology that showed visual depictions. It had poetry about Indian corn. So that's one example of a book for the Columbian Exposition. There was also a cookbook prepared for the Columbian Exposition, in which, or for which, different lady managers contributed their favorite recipes. Poetry for the Columbian Exposition. We probably found maybe a dozen or more books that came out of the Women's Building Library.
I did a good share of my research at the Wisconsin Historical Society, where I was teaching at the time, and they made an effort in the late 19th century to collect everything that was in print about the Chicago World's Fair. And so there are like 6 feet, 7 shelves of stuff. And I just sat there and pulled all this stuff, including most of the books that Sarah was talking about. A lot of material.
I see the time is 4:30 now, and so I think that...
Can I make one more?
Oh,
one
certainly.
more? Okay. How many of you went to a Carnegie Public Library as a child? Okay, look at that. All right. So now I'm going to thank the General Federation of Women's Clubs, because the women who were part of women's organizations and came through that library took these ideas home with them, and they, for the good part of that decade, establishing public libraries was priority number one of the General Federation of Women's Clubs and the state women's clubs. So when they went to Carnegie for money, he gave them the money for the building, they got to decorate it. And I would argue, John, that the reason you have that rocking chair in the youth room back here goes directly back to Candace Wheeler's influence on that building. And for decades, back to your argument, your question about patriarchy, for decades, the library profession has walked away from the homey description. Yet, I'm currently writing a book on the history of the American Public Library from the user's perspective. And almost to a person, the users are saying, I loved it because it was like home. So I think the women who, Sophonisba Breckenridge argues 80% of public libraries in this country were started by women's clubs. I think she's right. I think the General Federation of Women's Clubs and women's club members of that time should take credit for the loyalty, a good share of the credit for loyalty that American population has towards public libraries.
Well, I would like us to thank once again Sarah and Wayne.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.